Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Reggie Mathis. I'm a third-year law student here at the North Carolina Central School of Law, and we want to welcome you to the iSpeak blog radio show, which has been being produced by Professor Reddix-Smalls, Constitutional Law 2 class for the fall of 2011. I also want to thank Ms. Jillian Mack, who's also a third-year law student here, for her work in producing the show. Today, we are being joined by the Dean of the North Carolina Central School of Law, Dean Raymond Pierce. Thank you, Dean Pierce, for joining us today.
Sure.
Today's show is about the Establishment Clause and ceremonial deism specifically, and we'll get into much more of a discussion, which has basically been going on for the past few minutes here in our mini studio. But before that, we just want to remind you that you can follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. And we want to remind you that the number to call in, and we hope that you will call in with your questions and comments today, is 310-807-5123. Again, it's 310-807-5123. Again, when you call in, I will indicate that you are on the air by the last 4 digits of your phone number. And then we will ask you to identify yourself and then to present your question or comment. This show is based on the First Amendment, and where we talk about issues relating to the First Amendment, and particularly today's show, the first few lines of the First Amendment that basically says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that's what our conversation today is largely based on. I'm glad to be joined by Dean Pierce, who has recently written an article entitled The First Amendment Under God, Reviewing the Coercion Test and Establishment of Religion Claims. It has been accepted for publication in the winter's publication of the Hamlin Law Review Board of Editors. And we want to thank Dean Pierce for being here today and joining us. Well, without further ado, we've only got 30 minutes, and we know we've got a lot to talk about, but without any further ado, let's get started. Could you talk to us, Dean, about this idea of ceremonial deism, and please explain to our viewers what the idea actually is?
Well, ceremonial deism, you mentioned earlier in my article, I actually included a description and some discussion on the concept of ceremonial deism. Ceremonial deism, to my best understanding, is a concept that probably has been best described by former United States Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in a case called Elk Grove, which dealt with the continued inclusion of the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. And Justice O'Connor stated that in her concurring opinion in that case, which basically ruled that it was not a violation of the First Amendment Establishment of Religion Clause for students in a public school in California to recite the Pledge of Allegiance with the words under God. And she said that there are some religious references in government activities. There are some religious references that are unquestionably tied to the history of the country and the faith of the founders of the country and the framers of the Constitution and the general citizenry of the country at that time. Religious references that continue to exist to this day in many of our government sponsored activities and ceremonies, to the point where these religious references have become more acts of patriotism and less acts of religion, where they don't exist in a way that furthers a religion as much as they are a part of ceremonials, whether it's graduations and pre-football game ceremonies. You say the Pledge of Allegiance. You go into certain courthouses and public buildings, and you still see the Ten Commandments up on the wall or things like that. Their historical basis is in the early days of our country, when the majority of those of faith were of the Christian or Judeo-Christian religion, particularly the Christian religion. So it is no small surprise that these references continue to this day. Justice O'Connor actually laid out 4 points of measure to determine whether or not something is ceremonial deism. And quite frankly, I find it a very useful analysis, because the reality is our country was founded by people who are largely of a particular faith. Might have been various factions of the Christian faith, but they were pretty much for the same faith. So for them to include terms like the blessings of liberty in our early documents, or we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created under God. I don't see a big puzzle that here 200 plus years later. Not only are those documents and those references still in the library, unless you're going to torch them out or burn them out, but they still continue to have derivatives in terms of ceremonies where patriotism is an issue. So that is where the concept of ceremonial deism comes from. But quite frankly, I think Justice O'Connor may have been the first justice to actually, kind of describe it specifically, but you had cases earlier, the Marsh case out of Nebraska, I believe, where the State General Assembly has had a historical practice of beginning all of its opening sessions with prayer. There was by someone who was being paid by state dollars to be on the payroll.
Right.
And the argument was that was the establishment of religion. And of course, the United States Supreme Court ruled that was not an establishment of religion. And I say that that's, probably was the beginning days of what we now know is ceremonial deism.
Dean, you talked about Justice Connor, the four things that she sort of listed as factors in evaluating religious references, and one of those I want to ask you about, because as you admit in your article, these have not really made their way into American jurisprudence, and one of them
because the United States Supreme Court has not had another case come before it since Elk Grove. That was 1995,
right?
On this issue.
One of the things that she talks about is history and ubiquity. Is it true, or is it fair to say that Christianity is ubiquitous in our culture, in our secular culture today? Because Justice O'Connor is also the same one who also talks about the secular purpose, and we look at the Lemon test, where different government actions have to have a secular purpose. Right. So is it fair to say that our country is ubiquitously Christian, or that we are Christian in culture?
I'll say this. I would say because it's the undeniable fact, that the dominant religion of the Europeans who came to this country was Christian, and so it is no small wonder, no small puzzle why their faith, their religious beliefs would make its way into government activities, government documents, so forth, so on. Now, having said that, I think the framers of our Constitution were very smart in putting together the Establishment Clause. Quite frankly, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison did that to prevent government from establishing a religion by raising taxes to start a church, which was actually what was going on. When the First Amendment was actually put together. However, do I believe that there are Christian-based references to this day, such as "God bless you," when somebody sneezes, or putting your hand on a Bible, or things that reflect or demonstrate are indicative or are evidence of the fact that the people who largely form the government that exists on this part of the continent were of a Christian faith. To the degree that that's ubiquitous, absolutely. It absolutely. I mean, how could it not be?
Okay. Well, we've got a Twitter question for you, if you don't mind taking. And the question comes from: aren't you violating the First Amendment by requiring persons of other religions to attend a graduation held at a church?
Absolutely not. The First Amendment. First of all, you're not requiring anybody. People don't have to come to the graduation ceremony. But graduation is such an important event in a person's life that courts have said that it is a requirement. Right. So it's not an issue. It's not a voluntary thing. But that question comes up because at our last graduation ceremony, yet again, because of the size of law school, we found ourselves with nowhere to hold graduation ceremony that was within our budget or which would be conducive to a graduation ceremony. So when it was suggested that we take a look at this church auditorium, quite frankly, I initially resisted it. I teach law and religion. I resisted that. I said, that's going to happen. I got out there. I walked into this place. I thought, this is not a church. This is an auditorium. This is like a studio in here. I mean, and I asked the guy, the facilities guy for this church, I said, and he was telling me, all the people that use this church, the state government, the city government, some other nursing school, private nursing school, they have a graduation ceremony there. A lot of the unions, some union group associations hold their meetings there. I asked him why. He said, because we're the only game in town. We're the only ones that have this large of an audience. I mean, of an auditorium. Why is that important? Because courts have said that when high schools and public schools hold their graduation ceremonies in a church auditorium, when that is pretty much the only game in town, where there's not an abundance of auditoriums or venues to hold a graduation ceremony, that is not the endorsement of religion. That is not the establishment of religion.
But isn't it compelled speech?
Let me finish.
Okay.
However, courts have seen where you do have an abundance of places to hold that, yet you want to steer them into a church that is the establishment of religion.
Mm-hmm. But is it not still compelled speech to force people to go to graduate, in order to receive their credentials, their graduating certificates or whatnot?
Compelled speech. I'm trying.
Compelled speech is when government, or in this case, the public school funded by the government, compels someone to go to a religious.
You mean compelled?
Compels them to go and to participate at a religiously affiliated place, such as if this were held in a synagogue. Let's say we had a synagogue or we had a mosque that could also contain 3,000 people.
I got your question. And I think what you're trying to say is compelled participation in a religious practice, which is
not even a religious practice, but if you don't want to go to a church and you're Muslim, isn't that not compelled speech?
Compelled attendance at a religious institution. Mm-hmm. Okay. No, because what you're compelling people to attend is their graduation ceremony at a venue where the courts have ruled does not promote and or establish religion. Now, let me say this too. I fully understand the sentiment to the contrary. I fully understand that, and again, that's why I was resistant. And quite frankly, last year, went before the students and say, hey, look, are you all okay with this? Go up there and take a look at it and see if it, presents enough of a problem that we should continue to look somewhere else and to hold our ceremony. And, the overwhelming majority of the students said, no, In fact, there was one graduate, a third-year student who was Muslim. In fact, she was in my class on First Amendment. And she joked and said, look, Dean, as long as when I walk in to get my diploma, nobody's trying to hand me some tract to try to convert me to Christianity. And there was none of that. There's none of that. There's no religious signs around the place. And you walk in, it was a graduation hall.
Dean, we've got a phone call. Caller, this is caller 7359. Please identify yourself and state your question or comment for the Dean today.
Yes, my name is Corey.
Okay, go ahead, Corey.
How you guys doing? Well, my comment has to do with the agenda of religion being supported in public institutions. I believe it's particularly subversive and adversive to constantly purport and support a religious agenda when it comes to education, particularly because those who are more educated realize that religion itself was simply a tool to corral and control people from its inception. There were simply things that we did not understand about society. Tribal leaders latched on to the fear of tribal members and used made-up ideas to support why things were just happening in nature that no one could explain.
Okay.
Later on, it became something that was used as a tool by the church to control the masses. And it always has been a control mechanism. And now that same agenda is being pushed blindly in schools, in Congress, in the government, without any credence being given to its foundation, which is a tool used to control people through fear. And now we blindly say that we pledge allegiance under God. Well, that same God was also used to bring over African slaves and enslave them to religion. Yet, African Americans especially are one of the most religious groups of people on the planet. And it's mind-boggling that people can know the history of religion, people can logically understand where it came from, yet still offer themselves over to these beliefs. Jesus had nothing to do with the enslavement of African Americans, yet was used as a tool. And while they were slaves tilling the fields, they were still worshiping the God that would have put them there had it been real in the first place.
Okay, you got a question?
You need to pay attention.
Do you have a question? Do you have a question?
No, this was my comment.
I like you have a question? Well, let me respond to that. I understand. I've heard that before, and what the gentleman, Mr. Corey, just explained his position on religion. But again, the courts are dealing with when they receive court claims of violation of the Establishment of Religion Clause of the First Amendment. They're going to examine the facts and make a determination whether or not that religious reference or that religious or the presence of religion somehow violates the protections afforded by the First Amendment, United States Constitution. And one of the things that courts have factored in, getting back to what Mr. Mathis started us with, courts have factored in the concept of ceremonial deism as a way of reaching a resolution that finds religious references constitutionally permissible.
Okay. We have another caller. Caller 3584. Please state your name and question or comment for the game, please.
Hi, yes. My name is Julia. I'm calling to respond to some of the comments that have been posed by Dean Pierce.
Okay.
As I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, you find no issue with the inclusion of religious references as they pertain to traditional ceremonies because we're a country that was based predominantly on the Judeo-Christian faith. I do agree with that. I also agree with Mr. Reggie Mathis that it is compelled speech to have a religious ceremony, or I guess a ceremony that's held in a religious arena, and then not, I guess, addressing the needs and the beliefs of other people that are in that institution. My question is, because Dean Pierce consistently says, well, the majority of the class was okay with it. The majority of the class didn't have a problem with having this ceremony at a church. What of the minority? What of the minority students who don't happen to have a Christian faith? Doesn't our, I guess, society protect the minority? Isn't that what our democracy is all about? That's my question. Thank you.
Well, absolutely. I think the protections are clearly there, and I think they are in our First Amendment. And we really, and since this goes back to the use of a church for a graduation ceremony, we kind of agonized over there for a long time. When we first had our graduation ceremonies, when I became dean, we held it down at a tobacco warehouse up under that water tower. And we've outgrown that. No, not only that, they don't allow ceremonies down there anymore because it interferes with the restaurants and the businesses that surround that location. So our next location was the ballpark, Durham Bulls ballpark. That worked a little bit, but again, I got calls and letters from parents saying, they were sitting on the third base or the first base line. They could not see their son or daughter walk across the stage because the line of sight along the third and first base line wasn't conducive for seeing someone walk across the stage. If you remember, we had the stage behind home plate. So the ballpark was out. Then we moved indoors to, the convention center out in RTP, the Sheraton Hotel. It cost us $25,000 and it was cramped. It went okay. We had several overflow rooms, but that cost was prohibitive. Someone came to me, Dean, there's a church up here that we can rent for $1,000 for $1,000, and I said, a church? No way, not a church. They said, but Dean, you wouldn't even know it's a church. It's one of these, big mega churches, and it's just a big auditorium. I said, regardless, we're not going to have a graduation in a church. as graduation got closer and closer, and we had nowhere, and I thought about using the McDougal gym here, but at the same time, I thought, let's have something nice for our students. So I was imposed upon to go out, take a look at this church. And when I walked in there, the first thing I thought was, wow, this is not a church. And for me, quite frankly, with my Pentecostal Christian background, I actually had a problem with that, with a church not looking like a church. But that's just my own personal opinion. That's a side note there. I said, well, this is just a big auditorium. And the facilities director of this church told me how many other groups use it because they're the only thing in town that can hold 2,800 people seated comfortably. So we had the ceremony there, and it was a great event. People enjoyed it, but you better believe I'm going to continue to look around for somewhere else because you can do without this controversy. I put this on the dean's listserv for law school deans around the country. You'd be amazed at the number of law schools. They're constantly struggling with trying to find a place to hold an intimate graduation ceremony that's just for the law school. It's an issue.
And Dean, I think what part of the issue with us getting back to the First Amendment is the idea of establishment. Are we in any way participating in establishing religion, or are we creating religion by allowing students or requiring students to attend a ceremony, even if it's a civil ceremony? Even if it has a secular purpose.
That's the question.
The fact that it's associated with religion, is that not in and of itself?
No, the answer is no. And the standard is, you take a look at the lemon test. Let's try the lemon test.
Right.
The lemon test, which is probably the oldest test for determining whether or not some government action amounts to a constitutionally impermissible establishment of religion, is a three-part test. First of all, is this action, does it have a secular purpose? Right. Okay. Right. Number two, does it either advance or inhibit religion? Right. And number three, is there an excessive entanglement with religion? Okay, number one, secular purpose is absolutely secular purpose. It's a graduation ceremony. Number two, does it advance a religion or inhibit a religion? We know it does not inhibit a religion. Does it advance a religion? No. Could a Christian say, hey, I got an advantage because, I graduated from in a building that is a Christian building? An advantage in what? So no, it's not advancing religion. I doubt if anyone's converted, or it's not advancing religion. Right. Third, is there an excessive entanglement between a government and religion? Is there some entanglement? Yes, because you're having a government-sponsored graduation ceremony in a building that has a primary purpose of promoting religion. But is that excessive? Absolutely not. You can go down the line to the endorsement test, which is pretty much the same thing as the lemon test, just collapsing the first two prongs. So you're really looking at whether or not this is an endorsement of a religion. No. And then again, the coercion test. And I guess that's when you say, are you compelled? Does this, and also actually courts in the United States Supreme Court and other federal courts have made a distinction on graduation ceremonies held in churches based on the age of the graduate. Where if you're talking about third and fourth and fifth graders, it might be an issue. But college students, particularly high school students who they say can go off to war and can vote, ought to be able to make a distinction as between and make up their mind as to whether or not, because I walk into this building that has the Ten Commandments up on the wall, whether or not that I'm going to feel compelled to participate in some religion. So the age group has a difference also. Believe you me, we actually did the legal research on this before we gave in and said, okay, look, let's have this our graduation at this church, and it actually turned out to be a great venue for the event.
Well, Dean, going back to the First Amendment a little bit, insofar as establishment, if the real issue, let's just pull back on this idea of the First Amendment, as the Founding Fathers would have seen it back in the height of the Enlightenment, in the Enlightenment period, where human rationality was really the driving ethic, and religious liberty, the freedom of conscience, the freedom to think, the fact that we were rational beings, as Thomas Paine wrote, which influenced Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Paine had a relationship with Ben Franklin. Mm-hmm. So if these are the ideas that the Founding Fathers would have been mulling with when they decided to include a Bill of Rights that included the freedom of religion, essentially a freedom from coercion by the government. Why would we not want our government to reflect a more religiously tolerant civil practice or civil ceremonies? Why would we not want our history to allow more symbols or to not allow any symbols at all? France has taken this issue somewhat lately in an increase in nationalism, where they have not allowed women to go in public with the head covering, and so it's raised questions. Either we have no religion in the public discourse, or we have a diversity of religion in the discourse.
Let me start.
But how does Judeo-Christianity work into that equation?
Here, let me start by saying this too. Justice Antonin Scalia, in his dissent in that Elk Grove case, quite frankly, that I mentioned earlier. Right. No, actually, it wasn't Elk Grove. Lee versus Wiseman.
Okay.
Where the United States Supreme Court ruled that a clergyman saying a prayer at the beginning of a graduation ceremony in a public school in Rhode Island was a violation of the First Amendment, an establishment of religion. And in his dissent, Antonin Scalia, amongst other things, said that there's the court's commentary on the establishment of religion claims is all over the map, so much to the point where our jurisprudence on the subject of the establishment of religion is an embarrassment. Mm-hmm. And my own personal studies on this, and as you mentioned earlier, I've written an article on this. He's absolutely right. It's all over the place on this thing because it is such a contentious issue. It's because religion is involved. Right, it's religion and politics. Right. So this is, we're not the first to struggle with this, but okay. Having said that, I quite frankly find I'm able to actually have some acceptance of this with an understanding that historically, when I say acceptance of this, the whole concept of ceremonial deism that you brought up earlier, because when you look at what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were fighting against, what they worked on to put into place, what they worked to amend in the Constitution, something was going on in Virginia at that time. We're long before the end of the Revolutionary War, and continuing afterwards, after the Declaration of Independence and after the Constitution was signed in Philadelphia. You still had states in this country, places in this country, counties and places in this country, in the 13 original colonies, where the governments were raising taxes to support churches. Particular churches. And you had, these guys, the Presbyterians and Episcopalians and these other sects in the Christian religion fighting amongst each other, for control. Right. And they were raising money to support churches. Right.
But if I may interrupt for just 1 second, how is that any different? And then I think we have one more caller. Is that okay? No more calls. How is that any different than someone saying, I want to go to the city council meeting, but I don't want to sit at the city council meeting if there's going to be a Christian or a Muslim or even a Jewish prayer at the beginning of the service?
Because if you didn't pay your taxes to support that church back then, you'd be thrown in jail.
Okay. Right.
You have your property taken from you. You could actually lose something.
Right. But there's still penalties if you don't pay your taxes a day.
But is there a penalty if you go to a
90 seconds?
If you go to a city council meeting, and at the beginning of the city council meeting, the chaplain says a prayer, which he's been doing for the last 150, 60 years. Right. Courts have said, well, during that moment, you can just ignore the prayer, step outside, or whatever.
But is that not a compelled act by the government?
But it is not. It is not an establishment of religion. Mm-hmm. And the term actually compelling, I think what you want to say is coercion. Has it been coercion? And compulsion, it comes in.
Well, compulsion's a little different coercion, right?
Yes, because it is. But the fundamental question is, is that an establishment of of religion in violation of the First Amendment? Right. And the courts have ruled consistently that is not.
Dean Pierce, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have this show with you. And thank you for listening today to our iSpeak blog radio show. Again, next week we will be back with more discussions on the First Amendment. The topic is government's regulation of obscene materials, pornography in particular. And we'll be joined by Nina Olu and Rita Asiedu. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Reggie Mathis. This has been produced by Jillian Mack and Professor Reddix-Smalls. Thank you and have a good day.